Welcome, everyone. Welcome, visitors. Welcome, family. Welcome, friends. You know, some of you may not know it, but in my earlier life, the other life I had before this life, I was an attorney. Yeah, how does that happen? And so when I was first called to leave the practice of law, I absolutely let God know there was a mistake. Wrong delivery. I wasn't signing for the memo. God and I, we realized, at least I realized, that a change of this magnitude couldn't be anything less than a crisis in a young man's life. A young man with a huge student loan who put a lot of work into law school and passing the bar and getting a job and starting his own law practice. And so for God to give you that metaphorical, tap on the shoulder and say, hey, I have a new idea, there was some inner wrestling. And God and I, we wrestled for a few years before this greater good that we understand is God won the battle. And I'm here today to share because we're talking about reframing a crisis this whole month. And so today I want to share that the battle was not apparent to the outside world. That the inside world, the inside of me, the inside of any invitation to change invites many conversations. And many times the struggle, if you will, which was absolutely real inside me, was between a spiritual self, a spiritual idea, and my human self, who I was that very moment. We're using a letter that was written by Dr. King to look at the eternal principles that he shared and bring them to relevance into the principles of change that we move through. And Dr. King says, human progress, it will never roll in on the wheels of inevitability. That it comes through tireless effort and a willingness to be a co-worker with God. Dr. King goes on to say that without hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of stagnation in our life. That time itself, when we fight so hard to stay the same, actually then becomes an ally with what we do not want to do in our life, which is stay the same. And so I'm realizing we must use time creatively. We can recognize it has no power, but it has all power. We can know one thing, that the time is always ripe to do something right. The time is always now to embrace a change. And I recognize that a symptom, an outer symptom of any crisis is always going to show up as an inner struggle. And I tell you, church, today, that the time is always right to move through a crisis so you can get to the other side of it. In a calm and centered consciousness, we can move through change so that is no longer in front of us, but has become behind us. And so I look back, I look into my own life. I mean, my own life was like a study. I take my own life, and it became like every sermon I'll ever need, through all of time. Change in my own life, how does it begin? It begins with a conversation that I have with myself, an idea that my higher self brings to the consciousness of my present self. And usually my present self will be like, no, I'm happy the way things are. And so each time change shows up in our life, it is an invitation to reframe the crisis, to move through the illusion of fear so that we can look back and realize the fear was never real in the first place. This wrestling, you know what I've realized? The wrestling is never about the change. It's never about if we want to change or not. It's never about what the dream is, do we want it or not. What the wrestling is an inner conflict of how I see myself. Today I see myself standing here, but God sees me, standing over there. And I have to move through a process. I like being over there. It looks good to be over there. Every prayer in that prayer box is an answered prayer, a belief that there's a higher idea in the mind of God. No one of us put the prayer in the prayer box because we don't want it in our life. But the inner conflict shows up because we see ourselves as we are today, and we want to become someone different. The more that I can see myself differently, the more that change is not going to rely on those metaphorical wheels of inevitability. The more that we can consciously and affirmatively, with direction and choices in our life, choose the life we will have over there. And this requires some work. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Give it up. I'm like, why don't you keep rooting? You see, this requires some work. Interestingly enough, I share with you, the work is not going to move me from here to my desire. That's just, man, on the wings of God, if you will. That just requires I trust Spirit, if you will. The work is to let go of who's holding me back yesterday. So you see, the events of our past, they have an effect, a profound effect sometimes, on what we choose to believe about ourselves today. So the work is letting go of an entrenched belief I have about myself today so I can embrace a Christ idea, a spiritual idea, and then I will just travel to how God sees me because I won't be holding myself back. I promise you, church, God never holds us back. It's not in God's nature. God is a God of creation. God is a God of dreams. God is a God of healing. There is nothing that holds us back except when that human self in us tries to pull us down. And so what happens is these events of our past, they affect how we see ourselves today. And then the way we see ourselves today affects what we choose to believe about our ability in this very moment. Now listen. This in turn, what we choose to believe about our ability in this moment has a profound effect on the conversations we have in our head. Did you catch that? So these conversations I have in my head, they have a profound effect on how I see myself and what my abilities are today. And then my abilities and how I see myself today has a profound effect on the choices I make and what I believe for myself. And what I believe about myself today has an effect on the conversations that go on in my mind. And so there's the conversation, the choice, the belief, the ability, the way I see myself. The conversation, the choice, the belief, the ability, and the way I see myself.